So, because you're going to have a difference in celebrating, a little bit of difference in celebrating in Russia as you would in, say, South America or in France or something. So I'll try to bring those things out too. All right. So are there any comments or questions on that or what we've been doing with Samuel or anything before I get started? Good. All right. Well, let's go ahead and begin with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu lasot b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments and commands us to engross ourselves in the words of Torah. All right. Tonight we are, like I said, we're going to be finishing off, but we won't be finishing off this chronology here. There'll be a little bit more to do because tonight we're going to be looking at the census down here. David is about 66 years old, and the purchase of the temple site at 68, and then we're going to go back over a little bit of the Davidic covenant, and that's actually backtracking to 2 Samuel 7, and then these last parts here, we're going to pull those out of Chronicles and Kings. Okay, so that's why I'm not mentioning there is a little bit of redundancy in some of the accounts, some of the tales there that we have in Chronicles and Kings that are the same in 2 Samuel, but we're not going to do all of them. I'll that's probably another at least one more lesson, maybe two more, to finish out everything with David, and I'll do that after we do the feasts. And some of the feasts, I believe, are going to fall on a Sunday or a Sunday maybe. So I don't know what our meeting schedule is, but I do know we got about 4 weeks before the feast begin, and I will be teaching each week before that. So you should have a good overview of all the feasts prior to when they actually occur, and you'll be able to well, I would probably be a little bit optimistic to say I'm going to teach you how to blow a shofar, but I can we'll talk about some of the shofar sounds, and then Yom Kippur, what all good things that you can eat for Yom Kippur. And that's very simple to give you that list. Nada, zero, nothing. And then Sukkot, then we'll show you some neat stuff about Sukkot with how to make your own sukkah and how to make a lulav and then how to decorate all of that. So anyway, I think it'll be fun. A lot of people enjoy the learning about the feast. So like I said, get your friends and your friends, and get them online, or give them the link that you click up on, and I'll be posting it, of course, a little bit more aggressively so we can get the word out to everyone. Okay, so enjoyed seeing everyone yesterday. That was a delight. All that were able to come out. Okay, let's go ahead. Now we're going to be right here in the last 4 chapters, and then we'll finish that off, and that we'll then pick it up after the feasts. All right, in chapter 1, actually these 4 chapters here that we're finishing off with, they're almost in some ways it's like when you sit down to the supper table and you see little bowls of just all sorts of little things, and there just doesn't seem to be a pattern or just a rhyme or rhythm to anything that's on the table. And that's what is that? Well, we're having a refrigerator soup tonight, or refrigerator leftovers, so that every once in a while you got to go through there, clean that refrigerator out, and finish off everything, and you just never know what little treasures you might find in some of those little bowls. Well, this is kind of what it seems to me like here on chapters 21 through 24. There are some things that we just didn't finish out before, and some things that are not in sequence, and so this first bit here, the first part of that is one of those things. They don't fall into chronological order, and they're kind of disconnected. And in the end of it, we still don't see David passing away. He's still alive. There's still some things to happen, but they don't happen in 2 Samuel. All right, so in the verse 1 through 3, and I'm not going to read all the verses of all 4 chapters tonight, because we still want to stay at an hour. Verse 1, now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. So David sought the face of Adonai. Adonai replied, "It is because of Saul and his bloody house, for he put the Gibeonites to death." So the king summoned the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of Bnei Israel, but a remnant of the Amorites. However, Bnei Israel had sworn a covenant with them, yet Saul had tried to eradicate them in his zeal for Bnei Israel and Judah. David asked the Gibeonites, "What should I do for you? How may I make atonement so that you would bless the inheritance of Adonai?" All right. Now, if you remember the Gibeonites, these were the guys that when Joshua and his band of Israelites, all of the Israelites had crossed over the Jordan. They were in the business of conquering Jordan, conquering Canaan. That they were just every city that they went to, they just conquered them, and people had the choice of getting up and getting out and leaving, or trying to put up a fight and dying. Those were the only 2 choices available. And God had said, "You don't have to die if you will just leave the country and never come back." But the people are somewhat reluctant to do that, so they fought and they died. Well, the Gibeonites said, "Well, now let's see if we can find another way." And so they went and they devised a way. They took some of their envoys, and they dressed them up in old clothes, and as if they had been traveling a long way. And they came to Joshua, and they said, "Hey, look, we're from over here in this one city, and we just wanted to let you know that we will not fight you. We will be your servants forever if you will just spare us our lives." And so Joshua actually made a mistake. It was a mistake for him to do that, but he says, "Okay, well, we'll grant you that, but you're going to be our wood cutters and water carriers forever and ever." And so they said, "Okay, yeah, that's better than dying." So anyway, then when they came to the next town, lo and behold, here it was. That was the town where they had these guys had said, we're foreigners. We're from a long way away, and so when you come, if you ever come against us, that sort of thing. So they deceived Joshua, and but Joshua had sworn an oath that they would be spared, so they were spared. And this was, they'd been spared now for 600 years. They were still living there at Gibeon. And so during the reign of Saul, he went ahead and broke that treaty, and he put a lot of Gibeonites to death. And nothing, it was a bloody slaughter. It really was. And so that was where we are now. Then Saul was deposed. killed, and now David is in charge. And so we feel like that this event that we're looking at here now probably took place fairly early in the reign of King David. And here is here's a map that kind of shows where all this kind of stuff went down. And this is for the entire chapter. So here's Gibeon right here. This little dot, you can see my my cursor there. That is Gibeon. Okay, and then you can see how close it is to actually Jerusalem. But in the days that Joshua was conquering Canaan, Jerusalem was in the hands of the Jebusites, and in fact it stayed in the hands of the Jebusites until David came along and took it from them. And so they didn't concern themselves too much with Jerusalem. And they were coming, Israel was coming down here. They'd come from Jericho, and they'd come then down to Gibeon, and that's when that's where they were. So Gibeon is, I think if I remember right, it's about 5 miles from Jerusalem. It's not very far, and so that's where it was. And you remember, then Saul was from over here in Gibeah, okay, and these guys were from Gibeon. All right, and so anyway, that's we look at this and we figured out this is pretty soon before or right after David took the reins in Jerusalem. And this was, this kind of tells us that God definitely honors his covenants, and he wants us to honor our covenants too, because our promises here, Joshua had promised the Gibeonites that, okay, they would not be slaughtered and annihilated. And so God held Joshua to his covenant, and he expected Israel to honor that covenant down through the ages. So when God is now to the point where he says, okay, it is time, that I'm going to punish Israel for this because of what Saul did. And so what he did, it was in the form of a famine. Well, then characteristically, David, he sought the Lord for, okay, what was this famine about? A lot of times these natural catastrophes, such as famines, resulted from Israel's sins, but sin was not always the cause either. I mean, sometimes you look at what happened to Job, that sort of thing. So there's nowhere, there's no mention elsewhere in Samuel that Saul had broken the Israelites' treaty with the Gibeonites. It was only here that it's talked about. So evidently, somewhere along the line, Saul had refused to acknowledge Israel's treaty with the Gibeonites and put some of them to death, obviously shedding innocent blood. Now, one writer suggested that Saul had made Gibeon his capital, and after a falling out with the native inhabitants there, Saul slaughtered them. But there's really, that would have been extra biblical text, and we don't really have anything like that in our text that would indicate that was so. And then there's also the possibility that, you remember in 1 Samuel 22, that when Saul executed the priests at Nob, N-O-B, that he could have executed many Gibeonites too. We don't know. But it just said that he killed them, and now God was holding Israel accountable for that. And so then we see that David had asked God, okay, what's the problem here? Why are why are we at this point having this famine? Okay, the prophets came to David, told him, okay, this is why. And so then David just takes off and says, okay, I'm going to go to the Gibeonites and find out what I can do. It's interesting. He asked God what the problem was. He found out what the problem was, but then he didn't go back and ask God, okay, what's the solution? What should I do about this? He asked the offended parties, and the offended parties said, oh, well, give us 7 sons of Saul so that we can string them up. And David said, okay, I guess so. And he rounded up, and the Bible lists all of the different, the sons, and they rounded them up, and one of them, he spared, remember that he spared Mephibosheth. That was the crippled son of Jonathan. And so there were 7 other guys, and one of them, or actually there were, I think, 3 or 4 of them, they said was from Michal, the daughter of Saul, but it might have been another one of that name, because I don't know, it would have just seemed to, maybe in David's mind, if he took if he did actually execute 4 sons that had belonged to Michael, or what, however you want to say the name. Remember, that was the daughter that Saul promised to David for a wife, and then he took her back, and she married another guy and lived a happy life until David then, after Saul's death, then he sent for Michal to now leave her husband, and he took her as his wife, which was a rotten thing to do. And she and her husband, both of them, were not a fan of that action, and so he didn't have a real good relationship with Michal after that. But it might have been the same woman, and it might not have been. But anyway, he gave over 7 sons or grandsons to Saul. Now it's interesting, though, that in under the Mosaic law, you cannot punish a child for the sin of the father. You can't do that. So here David is hanging, or allowing to be hung, the sons or grandsons of Saul for the sins of their father. And the way that was explained was that these guys, possibly, I'm not going to say probably, but possibly had participated in the slaughter of the Gibeonites. So they themselves also were guilty. And so that's how it was explained. But as we know, David was not immune from breaking God's law when it suited his purposes. So anyway, what happened is that the Gibeonites hung these guys, and then one of their mothers was mourning and keeping the vultures away from the bodies and all that for a long time. And so David heard about it, and he says, no, this is not right. And so let's gather up all of the bones. And at the same time, they went, okay, let me get back to my map over here. They went back up here to Jabesh Gilead. You remember that it was at Jabesh Gilead, well, actually at Mount Gilboa, Beth Shan actually is where it was, that Saul was killed up on this little hill, and he was killed along with Jonathan, or they actually killed themselves, but they took their heads and so forth. But then the men of Jabesh Gilead then went and took the bones of Saul and Jonathan and buried them over here at Jabesh Gilead. So then now David is going back over to Jabesh Gilead to get the bones, also get the bodies of these 7 sons of Saul here, and they brought them then to Jerusalem for a proper burial. So that kind of closed the loop on that. The sins of Israel had been atoned by the blood of the sons of Saul, and now God opened up the heavens. They got the rain that they needed just in time for their to have a good harvest. And so that was that part of that chapter. All right. And so then the other part, the last few verses of the chapter, talks about some of the wars that the Israelites fought against the Philistines. Again, now these little wars or battles that we don't have a timeline for them. Actually, we don't really know when those things occurred. They were most likely earlier on in David's reign, because that's when he was doing most of the fighting against the Philistines. But it did talk about how that David was in the thick of the battle. He was chasing one of the guys, and then he got really tired and sat down. And so one of the Philistines snuck back, and he was a pretty big dude. He had a great big spear, and he was going to kill David. But then one of David's mighty men jumped in front with his spear and with his shield, and knocked away the spear, and then he killed the Philistine. So that's and then after that, his men got together and told him, David, you cannot go into battle like this anymore. Okay, you're too valuable to the country, and if you're killed, then the light of Israel goes out. And so they realized that what a valiant warrior he was, a brilliant king in terms of battles, and so they needed him. He had his faults, of course. We all know about his faults, but they really needed him. So anyway, now that pretty much closes out chapter 21. Are there any comments or questions? Please, somebody have a comment or question so I can get a drink. All right.
I put it in the chat, but you may have missed it. Considering the proximity between Gibeon and Gibeah, it would be likely that Saul would have a great bias or cultural distaste for Gibeon, kind of like being high school rivals where they're right next to each other, and not pals because they had some cultural clash anyway. And it may have been part of the reason that he was just so vicious against those folks in Gibeon.
It could have been. It could have been. And then you got to also remember that the Gibeonites were not Israel. They were not Hebrews. So there would have been probably an ethnic bias against them by all of the folks in Israel, perhaps. I don't know. But they were definitely not Hebrews, and they had deceived Joshua. So they, looking at the way that the Israelites then, or Israel, went against the Samaritans later on, it's not unlikely that could have also been something. Lynn Lynn, did you had your mic open or no?
No, yeah, my mic is open.
Yeah, it is now, because I had unmuted everybody, but it had popped open before I unmuted everybody. Okay. All right. Okay. Well, are there any other comments or questions? Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and mute everybody back again, and we'll go on. Now, the next chapter is I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, It is a song of praise to Adonai from David. And actually, if you look at Psalm 18, it's almost an exact duplicate, maybe a word here or there, but essentially, they are exactly the same poem in exactly the same format. It's just um, there are a few words that were just a tiny bit different, and that's all. So David, one thing that we could consider is that David, he had beaten everybody. He had, for a time in Israel, a time of peace from his enemies outside, his foreign enemies. Now, he had a lot of trouble from his domestic enemies, basically his family. But he did enjoy a period of peace from outside influences: Philistines, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Moabites, the snake bites, and all of that. And so during that time, that he was able to um, do a lot of things musically, actually. And we will see then in later lessons, not tonight, but after I finish with the lessons on the feast, that we'll see some of the things that David did with the time that he had available to him now that he wasn't fighting. And it's kind of interesting, some of the things that he did that carried on for another 1,000 years, actually. And in fact, well, some of the Psalms that he wrote, we are still singing today, 3,000 years later. And so that's quite a legacy that we're singing 3,000-year-old songs written by the King of Israel. So that's all I want to say about that. If you want to look at chapter 22 and kind of look at then over on Psalms 18, they're the same thing. It gives you an example of some of the things that David wrote. Of course, he wrote many of the Psalms, and the Hallel songs that we sing, at the various feasts, the things that the pilgrims that would, when they're on their way to Jerusalem, and they would sing the songs of ascent, of Psalm 114 through 118, the Hallel songs. The Hallel songs are also sung at Passover. That at the end of the Passover, you'll sing some things out of the Hallel Psalms. And so just a real rich heritage that David left all of us, that has carried on now for 3,000 years. I don't know of any other culture where the things that were written 3,000 years ago are still being actively sung and used in worship today. So that's quite a testament to a bunch of people that everybody's been trying to kill us off for 3,000 years. So just by the mercies of God, we're still around. Okay, now chapter 23 talks about the last words of David. And I'll just go ahead and read this first 7 verses here. It said, "Now these are the last words of David, the utterance of David, son of Jesse, the utterance of the man raised on high, the anointed of the God of Jacob, and the sweet singer of Israel. The Ruach Adonai, the Spirit of God, has spoken through me, and his word is on my tongue. The God of Israel has said, the Rock of Israel has spoken to me, he who rules over men righteously, he who rules in the fear of God. He is like the light of the morning when the sun rises, and a cloudless morning of glistening as grass springs from the earth. Is it not true that my house is with God, for he made an everlasting covenant with me, ordered and secured in all things? Will he not make all my salvation and every desire come to fruition? But the worthless, all of them will be thrust aside like thorns, for they cannot be picked up by hand. But the man who touches them must be armed with iron and a shaft of a spear, and the shaft of a spear. They must be completely burned up with fire on the spot. So this, again, David is kind of waxing eloquent. This is a combination of kind of a final song, and that's in chapter 22. That was his little final song, and then his last statement in chapter 23. But we also know that there's some other stuff that's happened, and so we'll look at those later on. But it's all coming down toward the end. And we can remember that in fact, we're coming up that in our Torah portions right now in our annual cycle, that where you had the final song of Moses, and then his last testament. That'll be in Deuteronomy 32 and 33. We'll be looking at those shortly. And so this is David's final literary legacy to Israel. It's not a deathbed recording, but more of a final public statement is what he's doing there. Because it is recorded later on, some things that he has said to his men, to his son Solomon, and so forth. So whoever wrote this part of 2 Samuel described David as simply a son of Jesse, a common Israelite, as someone who God has raised up, in contrast then to the self-made man kind of a thing, and whenever I hear somebody talk about a self-made man, I remember a fellow that came to one of our classes, engineering management classes at the academy, who described himself, and I mean, he had all of Maslow's buzzwords and some of those other management gurus back in those days, and talking about he was a self-made man. He did everything by himself, and I remember thinking about, well, boy, what a puffed up peacock that guy is. And it was, and so David didn't look at himself like that. He looked at himself as one that, yeah, God had chosen him, and he had anointed him for his role in life. He just acknowledged that. And so he was the Lord's anointed. He was a psalmist, a songwriter, singer, and so these four descriptions of David, they picture his leadership in relation to his family, his political administration, his military forces, and his spiritual influence. Now, some things he was more successful in than in others. Now, he claimed that the words that he spoke were they had been received from God, up there in verse 2, and he gave God the credit for any inspiration that he might have, and he also, all through his reign, he recognized God as the real ruler of Israel. He never ever let it go to his head that now he was the ruler, independent of what God did or anything like that. Sometimes he kind of let his kingly position overload him, and he ended up doing some stuff that he should not have. But for the most part, as a king, he was a pretty good king. And I think a lot of people, in these verses here, you'll look at verses 2 and 3 and 4. I mean, that they're a reference to the Messiah. You kind of have it in a way. You kind of have to stretch that, but they are recognized, verses 3 and 4, as messianic verses. And but it can also describe David and some of his descendants. So the figure of the dawning sun pictures the righteous ruler. He's a source of promise and joy and blessing to his people. and the sprouting grass that he talked about, describes him as a source of prosperity and new life and fertility. And so all of those kinds of descriptions are, I can really connect with those, because sometimes I'm out many times just as the light is coming up in the morning. The sun isn't even up yet, but I'm out and about walking around and seeing that the things, some of the grasses and so forth that are just sprouting up. A lot of times in my garden bed where they're not supposed to be, but they are. And you see the grass sprouting, or the dew on the grass. And this time of year, if I let the grass grow too long and they seed out, then the honeybees are just all over that grass, and I don't know if they're getting pollen from it, but they're also getting the moisture off of it. So that idea of prosperity and growth and so forth, it's kind of special to me. I really enjoy that kind of imagery. So David viewed his dynasty this way because God had made him an everlasting covenant. He talked about that in the verse 5, an everlasting, the Davidic covenant. So this actually, because of that, it resulted in, he had security. He was delivered from their enemies, and it was basically a fulfillment of the desire of David and of the people to just live in peace and security in their home. And this is the first time that they'd really had that kind of thing ever since Israel had taken over Canaan. Now, little pockets of it had, they throughout the period of the Judges, there were times where the parts of Israel that were ruled by one judge or another had a period of peace. I mean, with Deborah, they had a period of, I believe it was about 40 years of peace under her rule. And other parts of Israel were getting the snot kicked out of them, and down in Judah. But up there in northern Israel, they had peace. But nowhere in all of Israel did they have a long period of peace up to this point, other than with the reign of David. So they'd gotten what they all desired. And on the other hand, the ones that would do harm to David, they said they'll be burned up like grass. And so David, just to kind of summarize it, David believed that the Lord sovereignly initiates blessing. It's only up to him. He picks and chooses who he's going to bless, and those that value it, if you recognize it and you value it, you make that blessing just increase on yourself and others. If we are chosen by God to do something, and we do that, and we recognize that that's what we should be doing, then the blessing is on us, and it increases, and it should go around to everyone else, that if we're blessed, we should be blessing others. And so that is a rabbi trail that almost started sounding like preaching, didn't it? All right, so let's go on down to verses 8 and 8 through 22. That they recall, that's the exploits actually of David's mighty men. There were like 30 chiefs, and they're all named below. In fact, there's a total of 37 that are named, and that's because obviously in battle some of them are going to fall, and so when they fell, they would be replaced. So David always had a cadre of 30 men around him who he could count on, through thick and thin, and a lot more faithful to him than his wives were. All right, so in 2 Samuel 23:13 through 17, I'm just going to read some of this. Once the 3 of the 30 chiefs, they're just telling stories at this point. Once the 3 of the 30 chiefs went down and came to David at the cave of Adullam during the harvest, while a troop of Philistines was camping in the valley of Rephaim. Now, this would have been early on in David's fight and struggle against the Philistines. David was then in the stronghold, while the garrison of the Philistine was in Bethlehem, his home. David said longingly, "Who would get me water to drink from the well which is by the gate in Bethlehem?" So the 3 mighty men broke through the Philistine lines, drew water from the well of Bethlehem by the gate, took it, and brought it to David. However, he would not drink it, but poured it out to Adonai. And he said, "Far be it from me, Adonai, that I should do this. The blood of the men who went in jeopardy of their lives." So he would not drink it. These things the 3 mighty men did. And I can remember as a child on my at my grandmother's house, she had one of these big Bibles, that a lot of people back then, and maybe some still do today, I don't know. They had what they call the family Bible, and it sat out on a coffee table or in a prominent place in the living room, especially if the pastor was coming over for a visit. And they would have this huge Bible. Well, my grandmother had this great big Bible, and I don't know, where, what kind or anything like that. All I remember was it was huge for a little boy, and it had wonderful pictures in it. Just, I was a real good picture reader. And so I remember specifically this story where it was some kind of an old drawing that that you would see from, like, I don't know, some of these ancient type drawings, a wood cutting type drawing or something, where it's just a black and white deal, that would have been made 300 or 400 years ago, of David pouring out the water. And you can look at the faces of these guys that David is pouring out the water. They had gone and got him a drink, and I can remember as a little boy thinking to myself, "Oh, how rude that is!" Because David didn't even say thank you. He just poured the water out. What was wrong with the water? And so now, of course, I understand what it was all about. But it's just funny how those kinds of little impressions will stick with you, and kind of even little false impressions sometimes. So, all right, there again, another rabbi trail. I apologize. So verses 24 through 39 list the names of the 30 valiant men, and like I said, that there's more than 30. There's actually 37. Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, killed a lion on a snowy, slippery day. And he also bested an Egyptian that was coming against him, even after he had lost his own weapon and the Egyptian was coming at him with this big old spear. Well, he somehow bested that Egyptian, took the spear from the Egyptian, and then killed him with it. So he killed the Egyptian with his own weapon. And then you had Eliam, the son of Ahithophel of Gilo. Now, if you remember, this man now, he would have been the father of Bathsheba. And so then he would have been David's father-in-law, but he was still one of David's mighty men, his valiant men. And in other places, he's called, instead of Eliam, he's called Amiel. So, I don't know what they turn the letters around, but it's a variation of Eliam. And his name means, "My God is a kinsman." So just think about it. The presence of Bathsheba's father in the list of David's 30 heroes even adds further to David's shame in his violation of Bathsheba. And then, of course, his grandfather Ahithophel was David's principal counselor. and her father and her husband Uriah were both among the 30 mighty men. I mean, how much more soap operatic can you get than something like that? That David had 3 men under his command, or in his, well, 2 in under his command, and another as an advisor, who were intimately connected to the wife that he stole. I mean, that's you can't make that stuff up. So the last name that is listed in David's mighty band of warriors was Uriah the Hittite, and of course, yep, he was the husband of Bathsheba, and so David had actually ordered the murder of one of his most trusted men. Yeah, that's pretty despicable. So. So here we come then to any comments or questions. We're coming up to the final chapter here.
I got a question.
Oh,
Okay, so I know how much you love the Book of Jasher.
yes, you
And
do.
so, so
For
were
all of
the
you other people, that was sarcasm. Okay.
Okay, so you're not a fan of the Book of Jasher because it's kind of been
Okay.
proven to
Go
be
ahead.
nonsense. So if there is a true Book of Jasher, like the one that Yeshua referred to, not the one that we actually have, that one was supposed to be a book of the stories of the mighty men. Are these the mighty men that the authentic book of Jasher is referring to?
Could very well have been. Yes.
Okay.
Could very well have been. Yes. I don't know for sure, because it has been a long time since I've even picked up the book of Jasher. I've got it over here in my library, but I've got a lot of stuff in my library that I've read and don't plan on going back to. All right. So, but yeah, if you had the full book of Jasher, the true thing, if we'd ever knew where it was, you find it in another Dead Sea cave someday. Um, that would be very nice to see how different that was from the fake book of Jasher that's being circulated these days. All right. So, chapter 24. Verse 1, now the anger of Adonai flared against Israel, so he incited David against them, saying, go, number Israel and Judah. And the king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, go about now through all the tribes of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, and number the people, so that I may know the sum of the people. But Joab said to the king, may Adonai your God add to the people 100 times as many as they are, while the eyes of my lord the king looks on. But why does my lord the king desire such a thing? Nevertheless, the king's command to Joab and the army generals remained firm. So Joab and the army generals went out from the king's presence to number the people of Israel. Now, there's a problem here. There's all sorts of little questions here. This is now the anger of Adonai flared up against Israel, so that he incited David against them. All right, so that would almost appear that God is mad at Israel, so he's calling on David to do something else that'll make him mad so that he can justify his anger in punishing Israel. But that's not the way it is. If you look at 1 Chronicles 21 and 1, we'll see that the he listed there, where so that he calls on David to do something, that's where is it? Getting back up to the verse. I got to change the page here. Okay, so he incited David against them. That he that's there, that's not God incited David. That's Satan. That and you'll see that in 1 Chronicles 21:1. It says, then Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count Israel. So it's a good thing that we had the writer of Chronicles over there, so that you kind of figure out, okay, now that makes a whole lot more sense. And so we don't Now we don't know really why counting the people was such a terrible thing, um, but it definitely was, and everybody knew it, and Joab knew it, and he tried to talk him out of it. The generals tried to talk him out of it, but he persisted. So they said, "Yes, sir." So they went their merry way. But um, possibly, let's just say it that way. Why did David want to do that? He's at the end of his life. Maybe he's just trying to figure out, okay, how full is my bucket here on my bucket list, and so that I can say, oh yeah, when I started out, we only had, you know. However many thousands of fighting men, but now look at us. We've got 10 times more. We don't know. God, a couple of times had them make a census, and but it was for the purpose of support and the building of the tabernacle and the temple and so forth. So it had a specific purpose in mind in the census. So to go against God and then go and have your own census was something that was definitely a no-no. Everyone knew it, but David persisted, and so they did it. So it took them 9 months. They took it, said, from Dan to Beersheba. In fact, they did not even, and Dan to Beersheba means from the north all the way to the south. And they didn't actually get it all done because they didn't finish. They didn't do the tribe of Benjamin, probably because the Benjamites were kind of they were, they were not the most friendly tribe to David anyway. So there's no reason to poke your finger in their eye if you don't have to. So you save that till last. And then, of course, they didn't count the Levites because they knew that you don't count Levites when you're thinking about how many men that you have for war. So God then afflicted Israel somehow, and David, he realized, I've made a mistake. This was not right. I don't know why I did it. What was I thinking? So what does he do? He goes to the Lord and confesses. He repents, and so the Lord sends the prophet Gad. It's I say Gad because if you were to say the in the pronunciation of it, it was God, G-A-D, and so I would have to distinguish God from God, so that you would know what I was talking about there. The prophet Gad went to David, and he had three choices from God. All right. And that was, and you see that in 2 Samuel 24:12. Said that, go and speak to David, thus says Adonai, 3 things I am proposing to you. Choose one of them, and I will bring it to you. So Gad came to David and told him, saying, 7 years of famine. Oh, and I got that wrong, didn't I? 7 years of famine shall come on you in your land. Or you will flee from your adversary for 3 months while he is pursuing you, or shall there be 3 days of pestilence in your land? Now consider and see what answer I shall return to him who sent me. Then David said to Gad, I am in a great distress. Let us now fall into the hand of Adonai, for his mercies are great, and let me not fall by the hand of man. All right. I was reading this account, the account of this, in the Antiquities of the Jews. It's a book written by Josephus, and he said that he says what they have here is David was thinking about these things, and he, in his choices, he had 7 years of famine. 7 years of famine. Okay, now if we have 7 years of famine, then the people will not like that because, there's going to be famine. They're going to be hungry, but I won't because I've got lots of food stored up. And so there could be resentment against me for that. that I would be prepared for famine, and they're not, and so that wouldn't be good. And so then he said, well, okay, what about 3 months of fleeing from an adversary? Well, okay, I'm not as young as I used to be. Fleeing from an adversary, that could also mean that I would have to leave Jerusalem open to the enemy, and there could be all sorts of repercussions there. That, I've got my mighty men around me. I could survive 3 months, but many people would be killed. So let's just look at the 3 days of pestilence. Probably thinking, and here again, this is Josephus's words, probably thinking, okay, three days of grasshoppers or locusts, we can handle that. Okay, it'll be tough, but it won't be as tough as the other. All right, what happened though was, in real life, uh, and David said, well, and plus, if it's a pestilence from God, it'll fall on me too. So everybody will think that, okay, David didn't get spared anything. And so then we see also then that this was in First Chronicles 21. So then what happened was that there was 3 days of pestilence. Okay, 3 days was, and it was a plague. It was something like they had never seen, and it struck people, and they got whatever it was, and they died almost immediately. That, a kind of a choking thing. It said, this is extra biblical. This is coming out of Josephus. But he said in some cases people were burying the dead, and they would fall over dead on the where they were burying their relatives. And so it lasted 3 days, and it killed 70,000 men. And or 70,000 people, 70,000 men. When the Bible says 70,000 men, we don't really know whether they're talking about actual, men, or 70,000 mankind people. But it said that God was looking out, watching this, and he saw the death angel with his sword over the threshing floor of I'm having a senior moment here. The threshing floor. It was just north of Jerusalem, and he had compassion on that. David saw this, and he got down on his knees and asked God for forgiveness and letting him go, and so at that point, then God said, "Okay, we'll stop the plague." And here it is, Aruna, threshing floor of Aruna. Now, I got a picture here of a threshing floor for you, just for those of you that didn't know, but can't imagine after these classes that you wouldn't know what a threshing floor was. That's what one is. And here is a depiction by some people, and most people, many people, most people, I don't, but many people say the threshing floor was right up here on Mount Moriah, and I think it was probably somewhere right in here and not up there, but it was also the place that we find out in First Kings and then in Chronicles that this is going to be where God is going to put, or that basically David and Solomon is going to put the new temple. And what it said there was that David went, and God told him, okay, you see the threshing floor, go and build an altar there and offer sacrifices to me there. So this is what David did. And Araunah was Araunah, however you say his name, was up there threshing at the time, and he saw David and all of his people coming out there to him, and he was concerned, but he went out there and bowed down before the king and asked him what did he want. And the king told him, "I says, I want your threshing floor." And he said, "Okay, you can have it, and all my oxen and yokes and everything too, to do your sacrifice." He said, "No, you can't. I'm not going to take something for sacrifice that doesn't cost me anything." Goes back to the water from the Bethlehem well. I'm not going to offer something or take something that costs me nothing. And so, um, anyway, then Araunah says, "Okay, well, price of the 50 shekels of silver." And so David counted out to him, and then he bought the place, and that supposedly became the place. And they also say, well, that's also the very place that that Abraham went up to with Isaac and was going to offer him as a sacrifice, and then they found the ram in the thicket, and so forth. So. A lot of these things kind of come together, but what I'm thinking about is that, okay, they're saying that the threshing floor was right up here where the praetorium, right here in the middle of. If you look at this would be like the Temple Mount, okay, and that they would have been, it would have been right there. But what I'm thinking, and the way I truly believe, and some people don't, and so forth. And if you don't, that's fine, because I've only come to this thought within the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years anyway. That the actual temple was down here between the city of David, which was over here to the south, and the what we call today the Temple Mount, um, for a variety of reasons. And here's an overall plan view of where the Dome of the Rock is today, the Roman complex, um, and various things. This would be where the actual temple was down here. And that's the way I kind of feel like it is. For one thing, right under here is there's still some springs connected with this Gihon Springs, so there's water there. There is ample water, and there's actually troughs dug into the ground. It's all they've started excavating some of that stuff, but there are troughs and so forth underneath there to wash away blood and for the sacrifices. Up here on the Temple Mount, there is no water anywhere. There is nothing there that would ever suggest that there was ever any water resident there. They would have had to carry in all the water that they had. Plus, the people that say that um, this Fort Antonio or Antonia, uh, that would have housed the 10th Roman Legion. No, there's no way that it's going to house 6,000 soldiers and 4,000 support staff in that small little place called the